We are live.
Yeah.
So, hello everyone. I'm Tommy Blanchard from Cognitive Wonderland. I'm being joined here by Mike Cohen, who is also a Substack writer, but also has a really interesting background. Uh, so, Mike was a very successful neuroscience professor, and then made a change of career to teaching quantitative methods. So has a number of books out, one of which just came out, which we'll get into in just a minute, but a bunch of books on using coding to learn mathematics broadly, especially the mathematics that underlie data science and artificial intelligence. And of course, Mike's also an expert in neuroscience and neuroscience quantitative methods. So one thing that I thought would be a lot of fun to chat with him about is um, what's the connection between artificial intelligence and neuroscience? And one way to go about that is we're going to start off, I think, just talking about your most recent book, which I think it just came out like a few days ago, right?
Yeah, last week. Yeah.
Yeah. So great. So you
Yeah.
should give the title and stuff, like let's plug the book.
Yeah, the title is something like I've been through a couple of iterations on the title. I'm mildly, no, maybe extremely embarrassed. Not so embarrassed. I'm somewhat embarrassed to admit that I don't know what the title is exactly. It's something like 50 machine learning projects to understand LLMs. Oh yeah, that's it. 50 machine learning projects to understand LLMs.
Right.
Um, and yeah, I went through a couple of iterations with the title. Initially, so there's a subdiscipline of deep learning and LLMs called mechanistic interpretability, which is a bit of a rebranding of what used to be called explainable AI
Mm.
or explainable machine learning. And it's, the idea is like these models take inputs, which are images or text or tabular data or whatever. And then they give outputs, which is, a category label, like this is a cat, or, there is, or, the human is smiling or something like that. Or, of course, language production with like chatbots. And then there's a ton of simultaneously extremely simple, yet extremely complex and incomprehensible transformations that happen to the data in between those two ends, right?
Yeah.
And so in that, that's like a really, really broad way of describing AI.
Yeah.
And at that extremely like non-granular scale, it's similar to humans, right? We collect data. We have inputs and we have outputs, which are like language or movements or typing and things like that. And lots of crazy stuff happening in the middle. So what are the representations that are happening? How exactly does a language model, for example, learn how to take numbers, tokens, like numerical representations of text, and transform that into something that is, I mean, people are rightfully critical of LLMs, but they are fucking amazing,
Yeah.
right? The capabilities, even of relatively simple LLMs like ChatGPT 3.5, right? It's still really, really impressive what it does.
Yeah.
And so how does it represent, what do its representations of language look like? How does it like know or understand things about the world, about syntax, about grammar, about style, writing style, things like that. So basically trying to answer those questions, that is the field of mechanistic interpretability.
Mhm.
I started my book focusing on mechanistic interpretability. It's related to AI safety. It's really important for AI safety. Um, and it's important for improving fine tuning and training of models. It's also just really interesting as a scientific discipline, like studying emergence in complex systems and so on.
Yeah.
But yeah, eventually, so some of the projects are really about interpretability, mechanistic interpretability. But actually, a lot of the projects kind of evolved into something slightly different, which was a little bit more focused on using machine learning tools to dissect LLMs and understand the architecture and the organization, what the activations look like. And there, my thinking kind of evolved into the following. If you want to understand LLMs, you want to understand transformer architecture and attention mechanism and all this stuff, how these things are put together. It's really hard in the sense that most people who want to learn about LLMs don't have the right background or don't have good enough educational materials, right? And so what I started thinking or realizing is that there's a lot of people who have background in machine learning, data science, statistics, who want to learn about LLMs, but if they take some really like detailed oriented CS course, it's just going to be totally incomprehensible, right?
Yeah.
And also like most, if you look around on YouTube videos or books or whatever, most um, introductions, most explanations of LLMs are basically one of two categories. They are training it completely from scratch, where you have to learn about gradient descent, you have to know about training in PyTorch, and or they are super high level and just about like using APIs to call, send prompts to ChatGPT 5 through your app that you're developing.
Yeah.
And both of those are fine, but I think there's something in the middle, which is people who they don't have a strong background in deep learning. They're not interested in just building an app using some mystery black box, right? And instead, they have, yeah, like I said, a background in machine learning, in data science, in Python coding. And what I wanted to do was create projects for people in this group so they can leverage their interest and knowledge in machine learning to like dig into the inners, the internal representations and activations and weights matrices of these language models, and then yeah, use that machine learning techniques to understand how these LLMs are put together, trained LLMs.
Yeah, that's really cool because like you're the kind of person you're describing is very much like me and a lot of former coworkers I have. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're we know Python, we know statistics and machine learning, and we're kind of like in the data science world. The data scientists are always expected to be the ones that like know about the AI stuff, but like it's not like there's any training that the typical data
Exactly.
scientist has that makes them particularly well suited. It's just they know how to, use some experimental design to make sure, like, okay, is this kind of doing what we want it to be doing for this feature? So I love the idea. Can you give us like a flavor of like one of these 50 um, uh, projects and like what you kind of discover by doing it? Like what do these representations look like? What was something surprising maybe that you found in terms of the transformations going on under the hood?
Yeah, so I try to have a mix of different kinds of projects with different kinds of analyses, different kinds of explorations. Some of them are a little bit more um, like simple and just focus on getting data out of like the attention, like the attention scores, for example,
Yeah.
and then just calculating them and plotting them, just making some histograms and heat maps and so on. And that's already quite revealing because you see things like these learned negative shifts in the raw attention scores. And why are they all, or most of them are negative? These are the raw attention scores are the pairings of token pairs, and they are used by the model to tell the model how much each pair of tokens is relevant for predicting what word should come next. And so why are they all shifted negative? If you look at a distribution, they're all negative numbers. It doesn't come from the weights because you can look at the weights and see that they are almost perfectly centered at zero. All the weights, this is also in a different project, all the weights are pretty close to being orthogonal. So they're all like they all meet each other at right angles. And so where do all these negative numbers come from and why are they there? So they come from training. They're just, if the model learns that I should make these dot products be almost entirely negative with only a very small proportion of the distribution being positive. And the reason why that happens is because when you apply a softmax transformation, all those negative numbers basically go to zero. And the small number of dot products that are a little bit positive get really close to one. So this is a mechanism that the model has used to learn sparsity, to extract sparse information. Because most pairs of words are not relevant for predicting the next word, right? Like most
Yeah.
pairs of tokens are, like a period and the, right? What does that tell you about what word I should use next, right?
Right.
So most pairs should be suppressed. A very small number should be boosted. And that's something that's a really important part of the attention algorithm that makes LLMs so powerful. And that's something that you learn by, like, you can you can listen to me say it, but like, I don't find that very compelling. I don't want to hear some other random dude in a purple shirt tell me how this thing works. I want to open up Python and see it for myself.
Right.
So that's the idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
So some are pretty simple, focused on visualizations. Some are a little bit more focused on analyses, like using logistic regression, for example, to see how much information is embedded in different layers of the model.
Mm.
And here you can do really interesting experiments. For example, it turns out the word can't, like abbreviation for cannot,
Yeah.
is made of two tokens in GPT-2. The first token is can, C-A-N, and then the next token is N apostrophe T.
Yeah.
So what you can do is run experiments where you import text from like Wikipedia, for example. And this is real Wikipedia data that was used to train these GPT models.
Mm.
You find the instances of the token for CAN, and then you separate them into two categories. You have the tokens where it's really a positive modal, so I can do this. And then the other condition would be where the next token is N apostrophe T, so I can't do this.
Yeah.
And then you stop the model, right? You stop the token sequence at the word can, and you give the model some previous tokens for context. And then you do a logistic regression and you see, can we use the context information to statistically predict which neurons inside, which like computational units in the LLM
Mm.
actually like know or statistically predict whether this is a positive modal or a negative modal. And it's a beautiful experiment. If, this experiment design really comes from perceptual psychology
Mm.
because the exact thing that you're looking at it's the identical token, the token for can. And what you try to do is predict what the next token is going to be. And the model has no idea. You don't give the token, you don't give the model that token.
Right.
And yeah, it's a beautiful kind of experiment. So I also have projects like that. And then there's also projects that are focused on manipulating different parts. So during a forward pass, you prompt the model, you can actually go in and find literally any single component you want in the model and manipulate it however you want. You can switch on or off a neuron. You can zero out its activations. You can take all the activations like within an attention head. You can leave all the numbers there, but just randomly shuffle the orders. So the global statistics are identical and all the patterns have been disrupted. So like it's like if you're a neuroscientist,
Yeah.
these are
I was gonna
beautiful
say this.
experiments.
This-
Yeah. Imagine you
um,
could go in and just find like one grandmother cell in the hippocampus and just switch it on and off whenever you want.
yeah. Yeah. Well, what this is kind of reminding me of actually is that at this point, kind of old paper from the coding lab, where can you understand? Could neuroscience understand a microprocessor? Was kind of the question, and so
Yeah.
you have access to. So that what they did was they ran a computer simulation of. I think it was like an Atari or like Nintendo microprocessor or something like that while it's like playing games, and you can actually see which transistors are on or off. So you have kind of full access to the system, just like you do with an LLM. And the question was, hey, if we apply these kind of standard neuroscience techniques, can we figure out how the processor
Yeah.
works? And their argument was like, basically, no, we're nowhere near, like the analytical techniques that we're using wouldn't be able to tell you anything particularly interesting about the processor and how it works, which is kind of like
Yeah.
Oh, Mike Colassa, I think, is sharing the link
Yeah,
to that paper in
yeah,
chat. Um,
it's a funny paper.
yeah, so it
I
just kind
think,
of like reminds me because it's like very similar situation. Like you're using obviously not quite the same techniques, but you also have full access to what all of the neurons are doing. And so I'm curious how you kind of think of getting into the guts of an LLM versus getting into the guts of a real brain. Like,
yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, it's so hard to, when you understand a system pretty well, but not fully, then it's a little bit easier just to like apply some analyses, do some experiments, and so on. The problem with complex systems like a brain and like an LLM or any other really large deep learning model is they are so fucking complex. The representations are warped so many times in so many nonlinear ways that we are really just not. I don't know if I mean it's debatable whether um, it is even possible for a human brain to understand that level of complexity. We certainly don't right now, right? Whether we will in the future or whether it's just a cognitive intellectual limitation is like a different discussion. But it's certainly the case that that we don't understand these systems now. There's just so much nonlinear complexity, and the issue with that level of complexity is that there's a lot of sparse coding, but also redundant and distributed coding. And so if you try to, so for example, in other projects in my book, what we do is um, go through correlatively and statistically identify which neurons are most important for categorizing a particular grammatical, let's say gender, like if the word is going to be he or she, for example. So then it's like, okay, cool. So we have found these, I don't know, 300 neurons in the LLM that are like wildly statistically significantly differentiated between, you look at the histograms, the distribution, no overlap in the activations for the word him versus the word her. And and then it's like, okay, so I don't want to conflate causality and correlation. So
right.
let's do the causal experiment. So you can go through again with the model and zero out those neurons
Yeah.
that you have statistically identified. And then it turns out like basically it's just kind of adding noise. Like the model is still just as good at identifying he and she. It's just kind of like noisier. And then it's like, fuck, I thought this was such a beautiful experiment. And the results are, eye-opening in the sense that it shows how much like complexity and redundancy there is inside this model. But yeah, it can be really, really difficult to identify. And also, humans are just not very good at thinking in nonlinear terms. When we think about nonlinear processing and nonlinear operations and so on, usually what we are thinking about is like linear approximations,
Mm.
right? And any nonlinear system or equation can be represented by a linear, like piecewise thing relatively easily if you zoom in enough. So what
Oh,
we are very good at as scientists is taking a complex system and zooming into it until linearity is reasonably good, right?
right. Yeah.
And yeah, but I don't know, that takes you pretty far, but as Cording noted, it's not really sufficient, but we're on our
Right.
way.
Yeah. I mean, I'm curious because I mean, would you say that we understand LLMs? Like, I'm just going back to your comment about like, oh, we're nowhere near understanding brains, and like LLMs are a much simpler system that we have much easier access to.
Yeah.
But it's not like there's research that people do on them, even though we built these things, right? It's not clear to me that we fully like understand them, or at least there's certainly more things that can be learned about the kinds of representations going on inside of them. So I'm just curious, like, kind of your opinion on like, do we understand them, and if not, like, what does it mean to have kind of like a full understanding of I don't know LLM?
Yeah, your first question is easier to answer. The second question is very hard to answer. It's just a hard question in science, right? What does it mean to understand something? People find this very confusing. Like, why don't we understand LLMs? Humans built them, right? They're so simple. Like training, the math of training LLMs is a little bit more involved because it involves like a little bit of calculus. But if you've taken a first semester calculus course, then you can understand how training works. But to understand all the math of a trained model doing a forward pass, like when you prompt ChatGPT and you press enter, literally all of that math is high school algebra. It's addition, multiplication. There's a little bit of exponentiation there. There's like the natural exponential, but it's all like really, really simple math. You can write it out in a couple of lines.
Yeah.
And yet, it's not just that I don't understand LLMs. Like no human being alive understands LLMs. And it's because you take all these very, very simple parts and you stack them all and they're stacked horizontally and vertically multiple times. And it just gets so complex and so like all these linear, nonlinear transformations just become so difficult to understand and so weird and like warped and things like that. So nobody understands how these LLM systems work. What does it mean to understand them? Uh, yeah, I think that well, there's multiple levels of understanding, right? There is a level of understanding of LLMs that we do have, which is when I put in these kinds of prompts, then I get these kinds of answers. Right. And the answers are always a little bit different because basically at the very end of the LLM, there's a probabilistic selection engine. So it doesn't only pick whatever token is most likely, it randomly samples from some collection of highly likely tokens.
Mhm.
But that, probabilistic selection notwithstanding. So that's a level of understanding where that we have. Um, and but do we understand? So, and then there's like the mathematical description
Right.
at a very low level, like each actual operation, and that we understand perfectly. But then the real question, I think what everyone really wants to know is like, do we understand how these LLMs think, in
Right.
apology course? Do we understand what the world looks like from inside their mind? I'm doing a lot of anthropomorphizing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what do the representations look like? This is really hard. The representations um of things, of facts, of context in an LLM is a vector in a very high dimensional space.
Right.
And it's like somewhere between 10 and 20,000 dimensions, so we cannot visualize it. And every time the model undergoes a transformation, like at the transformer step, with the attention adjustments and so on.
Yeah.
This super high dimensional vector gets rotated a tiny bit, like it moves around a little bit. And what does that moving around mean? It's somehow related to taking context that the models learned about the world from previous tokens
Mhm.
and then loading it onto the current vector. And so, yeah, it's just this is not a way of thinking that we are really capable of understanding. It's
Right.
just, it's way too high dimensional. It's way
Yeah.
too weird.
I'm trying to think about like, going back to neuroscience, like we have the Mars levels, right? Which is kind of like
Yeah.
trying to take that lens here where for those that don't know, there's this is a kind of classic way of conceptualizing what we're trying to understand and explain in neuroscience. There's three different levels. There's the computational level, so what is the like high level description of the problem being solved? The algorithmic level, so what's the actual like algorithm, the representations going on, and then there's the implementation level. How does that computation actually get done? And this is kind of a funny situation because with LLMs, um, I mean, by some definition at least, we have total visibility into the implementation level. But then, like the other levels, Like, I don't know, like, is that even a useful lens to take to LLMs when we have this level of, like, insight into the guts of the system? Uh, yeah, curious your thoughts.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know what Mars would say about these kinds of models. I'm not sure that it's still so relevant. Like if we go to real neurons, biological neurons,
Hmm,
we still don't understand how even a single neuron really works,
yeah.
right? To a very rough approximation, the answer, we kind of do. Like there's input at the dendrites, and then when it exceeds a certain threshold, then there's an action potential, like this jolt of electrochemical energy. That's true, but it's not really that's not very satisfactory. It's like it's true in the sense that, like how does a car work? Well, I can explain to you how a car works. When you want to go faster, you push this pedal. And when
Right.
you want to go slower, you push that pedal. That is true. That really is how a car works. But
Yeah.
if you are an engineer or a physicist, that's not a satisfactory answer. So how does a neuron work? Like a biological neuron? Yeah, you can have this high level description, but that's not a really accurate description. And I bring this up because it's a complete contrast with LLMs and deep learning models in general. At this very foundational level, we understand exactly how they work. We invented them, like we humans. I wasn't involved in inventing LLMs, but we humans invented them. So of course we understand at the unit level and the implementational level exactly how they work. But then there's the representational level that the models learn these representations on their own, just based on like gradient descent and so on, based on like feedback that we give them.
Yeah.
And those representations, yeah, I mean, it's kind of like in medicine, like if you go to a doctor and you say, I have this problem, and the doctor says, oh, there's this great new pill that treats this condition. We have no idea how it works, but it works pretty well in most people. Are you going to say, I refuse to take this pill until we understand the exact molecular pathway of this medication?
Right.
No, you're going to say, okay, great. I mean, I hope that my government continues to fund science so we can understand how this thing works. But in the meantime, I just want it to work. Yeah. So,
Yeah, it's interesting. Like in some places, we want to understand the mechanism really well. In other places, like health is kind of it's funny because I complain a lot about people focusing on mechanism a bit too much in places where what you really care about is the effect, right? So like a lot of the wellness stuff that you've seen me complain about, it's people saying, oh well, you know. This is how neural plasticity works, so you should do this. And it's like, well, have you tested that actually helps you
yeah.
learn better? Like that's what you really care about. Like neural plasticity is complicated. You can make a story to that is science based about any possible regimen that you might make. You really just need to test it because there's just too many mechanisms at work with learning. So yeah. Uh, to bring us back to a comment you made, because I think this is a good opportunity to bring us to a post that you made recently about the complexity of neurons. It's probably like surprising to a lot of listeners that like to hear you say, "Oh, we don't actually understand how a neuron works," because come on, like
Yeah.
if we understand anything about the brain, you would think that we'd understand like the basic fundamental unit, or what's thought to be the fundamental unit. So tell us, like, what is it that we don't understand about a single neuron?
Yeah. I mean, maybe I can start with a little bit of history, right? So before the microscope, there was just this idea. I mean, people knew that like thinking and cognition and motor and so on came from the brain, right? But they didn't know what tissue meant and what tissue comprised, right? So then it was like microscopes started to be not just developed, but like increasing in power and accuracy. And then There's this really brilliant anatomist named Santiago Ramon y Cajal, and she developed these dyes, this way of basically staining a little slice of tissue where all of the cell bodies would turn purple and everything else kind of just faded into the background. And so he did this staining, and then he looked at these slices of brain tissue, and he made these beautiful drawings. Right, this was like 100 some odd years ago, so it wasn't like he didn't have an iPhone, so he had to just do all these drawings himself.
Right.
Um, and so basically, what he saw with his staining technique is that there are cells that are physically separated from each other. And that's what he saw in the microscope. That's what he drew on paper. And so from that, that kind of developed what's called the single neuron doctrine. And that's the idea that the single neuron is the elementary unit, it's the physical unit of information processing in the brain. And the mechanism of exchange of information is the action potential, which is, yeah, this like jolt of electricity that goes down the axon once the soma or the cell body is gets enough electrical activity from its inputs. So I mean, Ramon y Cajal was not wrong. Right? But
Yeah.
the problem is that he could only explain the brain in terms of what he saw. And what he saw was limited by the techniques that he was using. And so, what he saw is that all of these um, uh, neurons seem to be physically separate from each other. So he drew a conclusion that was appropriate based on the data and the methods, but the data was coarse and the methods were rudimentary. And it turns out that neurons are just they're more like richly interconnected. They have physical connections between each other.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of the reason why we continue in neuroscience, why the single neuron doctrine continues to be the most prominent view is that it's so simple. It's so easy to understand and it's easy to explain. Right? Like you could explain to your grandmother that in the brain there are individual cells. A lot of them look like, pyramids, and they send out like one phasic jolt of electron. It's binary, right? We can
Yeah, right.
analyze it with data. We can talk about it, but I think that's wrong. I mean, there's actually a lot of evidence over decades that the single neuron doctrine is not useful. I mean, well, I don't mean to say it's not useful. It's not correct. It's not the full answer.
Right. It's not the full story, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, but we stick with it because it's so compelling.
Right.
It's so simple. It's so easy to understand, and you can also imagine like a biologist who's not a mathematician. They're not trained in statistics and data science.
Hmm.
They need a way to treat the data that is just, yeah, very easy. So you say, how many action potentials per second came out of this neuron? And that's my measure of the activation of the neuron.
Yeah. Funny fact about Cahal, I only learned this like last year or something. I didn't realize he was an old timey like bodybuilder. So you can find these pictures online of like him like posing like a bodybuilder. Pretty cool. Nobel
I didn't know
Prize
that.
winning neuroscientist, like legend in the field, and he's just like flexing
Yeah.
his muscles. Um, but so when you say the single cell doctrine is wrong, like I guess one way I might think of it is, um, we know there are a lot of different mechanisms in the brain. Some of those have a larger influence than others, and the um, uh, firing rate of neurons is one of the mechanisms. Like it's, if you had to capture a single dimension, that would be probably your first, the first variable you'd pick to like explain the most variance. So do you disagree with that or?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I missed. I was getting too excited. arguing against single neuron doctrine. It's not that it's wrong.
Yeah.
It is. It certainly is correct as a first approximation. As a relatively coarse way of trying to understand brain. What is also true is that the closer you are to the outside world, the more the single neuron doctrine seems to be important for coding. And by outside world, I mean like the retina
Right.
and the motor neurons,
Right. Yeah.
right? So in the brain, if you think about how many synapses away is a given neuron from the outside world, the smaller, the fewer synapses there are to get from that neuron to the outside world, the more the single neuron doctrine seems to be a really useful measure. The problem is when you start getting like deeper into the brain, further away from the outside world, in prefrontal cortex, in parietal cortex, um, in the striatum, and there it just yeah, counting the number of action potentials per unit time, like within a second, is just like it works in the statistics in the sense that you can get some effect with p less than 0.05, but you need to get a lot of data over like hundreds of trials. You need to pull together data from dozens or hundreds of neurons in order to really see very compelling relationships between action potential counts and some behavior or some sensory processing thing. And so what that tells me is that but we don't work like that, right? It's not like if you're trying to like if I look at say, there's a book behind you that's orange, right? Like
Yeah.
for me to see that it's orange, it's not like I have to look at it over and over and over and over again over 30 minutes. And then I finally average over all of those glances. And then I come to the conclusion that it's orange, right? I mean, it takes me, I don't know, 100 milliseconds to come to that decision. So I think Mike Kalasa
It
will
depends on the.
respectfully disagree with me. Yeah, which is great. Um, but yeah, I guess the point I want to make is that our internal cognition and language production and perception is so fast, and it's not perfectly veridical, but it's so like reliable that and the action potential data. So the single neuron doctrine approach just cannot account for the acuity and the speed with which we experience reality.
Okay. So, what do you think is missing from that picture? Like, what are the other mechanisms here that you?
Well, I mean, if I were smart enough, I would probably have. If I was smart enough to know that, then I would know it already. Yeah, I don't know. I think part of the answer has to do with um, very broadly distributed patterns of electrical signaling that happen over different frequencies. So that it's an analog signal, not a binary signal like action potentials. So it's something in the LFP, the field potential. It's happening at with different spatial patterns and at different temporal frequencies. I think there might also be there might be a lot more internal calculations than we appreciate, like internal inside the neuron body, as opposed to just looking at the output of the cell. I mean,
Internal to what?
so normally in electrophysiology experiments in neuroscience, we measure the electrical activity from the cell. And the way that works is we're basically measuring the change in the electrical field outside the cell,
Yeah.
either like LFP or EEG, which is the aggregated activity of large populations of cells,
Mhm.
or if it's an action potential, you're still recording from outside the cell.
Mhm.
You're just focusing, you have a tiny electrode, it's very
Yeah.
close to one
Close
neuron.
to. Yeah.
So it's like, you know, it's like you want to understand internal medicine, but you're only looking at the skin. Right? So mostly we just measure the electrical activity from outside the cell. And there's all sorts of really complex computations that take place inside each cell in the dendrites and in the
Right.
soma.
Yeah,
Um,
I thought you shared a really nice figure that like I had heard before and just, you know, I was an electrophysiologist, so I didn't really pay too much attention, but I had heard there's lots of complicated computations happening at the dendrites. But the figure that you shared that showed like, oh yeah, like these are where we know different as different branches come together. There's different computations that can be done joining together the electrical currents running through the dendrites in different ways. And I think that's really helpful and makes you realize, oh yeah, dendrites are pretty complicated. They're a lot more complicated than artificial neural network connections, where it's just like they don't interact, right? It's just straight to the unit. Um, I'm curious what when you were talking about the LFP, like, do you think that is like a causal mechanism? Because like you also said, like, oh, that's the aggregated activity of a lot of different neurons. So, do you think that that is uh, these electrical fields are causal, or do you think that they are just telling us about something that's going on? Because I've seen other, you know, people talk about like, yeah, you know, there's kind of this constant cycling going on in the brain, and that these frequencies that we're detecting are just like indications of that cycling, and that cycling can explain a lot of the way that we perceive, right? Like that stuff, that input is just altering that constant cycling in some way, and that might explain the things. But other people have also suggested that maybe there's more of a causal mechanism of those. I'm curious your thoughts.
yeah, it's really difficult to establish that level of causality in the brain. It's difficult to introduce really carefully controlled manipulations at that level.
Right.
Um, I think it might be both. So what is true is that the like ambient electrical field modulates the excitability of individual neurons. And the excitability of individual neurons is basically like how like I don't know, tired versus awake the neurons are. So neurons, even if you hold the input constant, they are more or less likely to give an action potential depending on how, you know, relatively hyperpolarized or depolarized they are. So basically like their resting potential.
Hmm.
So what these electrical fields can do is like subtly modulate these um, uh, uh, um, phases of hyperexcitability versus or hyperpolarization versus depolarization, such that at the aggregated level, neurons will have a higher probability of firing at certain phases of the oscillation and lower probability of firing at other phases of an oscillation. So that can be used to like group together or like cluster together groups of neurons that are kind of working on similar computations.
Right. Yeah.
Um, there's also like apoptic coupling, which is like direct electrical coupling between
Yeah.
neighboring.
But I thought that was much more rare in the brain. My
Yeah.
I don't
So
know that
I
much
don't
about
have
it.
a
I just like
yeah. I don't have a strong opinion about apoptic coupling. I do suspect that this kind of LFP modulations are a little bit more like creating this kind of stage that modulates what the neurons are doing rather than like completely regulating how and when they fire. Right.
right.
So what you also see in the brain is that it's not just the number of neurons, or sorry, the number of action potentials that are emitted. It's also really about the exquisite timing.
Yeah.
Right. So even a couple of milliseconds delay can have an impact on the calculations. And
Right.
so if you have some field potential that is, you know, sort of probabilistically creating these tighter windows in which action potentials are more or less likely to occur, then yeah, that might not be a direct part of the computation. It might be something that is kind of like creating this space where certain kinds of calculations are easier to implement versus harder to implement.
Yeah, the actually when you were criticizing the single neuron doctrine, I thought that the first thing that you were going to mention is like we know that the it's not just firing rate, it's also the timing, which of course is important. But I think that the broader point that you're bringing up, which is a really good one, is like there's a lot we don't know just about the what mechanisms even are causal. What's just like an accident. You brought up in one of your posts that like astrocytes, these cells that are seen as supporting cells, seem to play a really important role. What is that role exactly? We're not quite sure, right? Like, there's so much we don't know about very basic stuff about how the brain works. Um, but one thing that I was kind of surprised when I read your post because I had kind of fallen for this, is you point out that like there isn't actually that good a relationship between the visual system and like image detectors. And
Mm.
one of the things you point out is like people make a big deal about like, oh yeah, the visual system. You have these edge detectors early on, and then so on and so forth. You have these other representations, and hey, we can look at image detector artificial neural nets, and hey, we find early on we find edge detectors and similar kind of cascade of features. And so I'd read that at the high level and kind of bought it. And you're like, well, actually, edge detector, you can look really close and you might find a couple, but like they're not nearly as numerous as they are in the human brain. And so I read you as saying like actually like there's not really a good relationship between the kinds of representations that the two are doing. Am I kind of quoting you or paraphrasing you correctly here?
Yeah, I think so. So this the relationship between different types of I guess just take one step back. So there's broadly two ways of talking about whether a biological brain is similar to these artificial networks in deep learning that we have created. One would be at the low level, like is an artificial neuron just like, or even a good model of a biological neuron? Most of my post, I argued no, it's not even remotely similar, but that shouldn't bother us. Like these artificial neurons are amazing, and they are amazing, and that has nothing to do with their irrelevance to biological norms. Okay, so that's one way, and then another way to characterize it would be to take a step up to like a higher level and a more abstracted level of organization, and there you can say, maybe nature has these certain organizational principles that are important for intelligence, for vision, for audition, for, time series prediction. And those computational elements emerged in any kind of system, right? So there you could make the argument, okay, there's no one-to-one mapping between a biological cell and an artificial neuron, but the way that nature figured out how to make a mammalian visual system is the way that these models figured out how to um, categorize images.
Yeah.
And so I'm a little bit more open to that argument. I think the first one that I mentioned about going from artificial neurons to biological neurons, I think that is completely wrong. I think
Yeah.
people who continue to perpetrate that myth are either they have never taken more than 30 seconds to really question that argument, or they're just trying to like sound smart, right? It's just a cheap marketing scam. Okay, but this second level of thinking about I'm a little bit more open to that. I'm not convinced that it is the same for like the mammalian visual system and these convolutional neural networks that can do like computer vision.
Yeah.
I think it's very difficult because we don't just want these computer models to see. What we do is we give them very carefully curated sets of images, which are images that we humans have taken with cameras and phones and so on, and thought that they were good enough to upload to the internet for everyone else to see, which means they already have some like subjective, there's a very hard subjective filter for the images that we give them. And then the things that we are asking the model to do are basically things that we do ourselves, right? So we look at a picture and we say, there's a cat, there's a cucumber, whatever.
Yeah.
And so now we're training the models to do what we do with images. And the models are built in this hierarchical way, right? So that information flows up, and then we also have specific. And when I say we, I mean we humans. I was also not involved in the development of computer vision models, but the way that they work is that the lowest levels of these computer vision models can only see a very, very tiny piece of the image, right? So they only get exposed, each individual filter is only exposed to maybe a 3 by 3 pixel square.
Yeah.
And then at the next level, you get multiple tiny squares that form a larger square, and then a larger square and a larger square. And then eventually it is called receptive field size. And eventually, at the top of the model, the receptive field size ends up being most of the image. So, there's multiple stages of selecting the data and training the model and building the model where we have imposed a very specific set of structures
Mhm.
and conditions and constraints onto the model. So it's literally impossible um, for a filter in a computer vision model that is an early stage to recognize a car. And why is that literally impossible? Because you cannot recognize a car from only a nine, from 9 pixels from a
Mhm.
3 by 3 grid. So, what can you possibly see in the images that we have taken and we have used as training for the model at a level of, 3 by 3 grid? The only thing that you can see is edges and
Right.
color, right? And so then, you find that at the earliest stages of the model, it learns the filter kernels that are learned are sensitive to edges, right? Not all of them, but some of them are. And so I don't see that. So I mean that's interesting and it's fascinating and it's amazing and it's beautiful and it's incredible that humans were able to do this sort of thing. But I don't see how it could have been any other way, right? I don't see that this is a natural, um, like organic process that nature solved in the same computational way in very different systems because we built these computer systems so that they kind of have to work that way.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Like, I don't know now. I wish I knew more about the history of like how these first networks were developed, like how much they were influenced by the visual system. Because when you're saying all of that, I think, well, at a very coarse level, that's similar to the visual system, right? Like we start out with the retina and the LGN, like very limited part of our visual field, and it uh, kind of blows up a little bit more as we go through the visual cortex, and then you get the same kind of thing. That's progression of more complex things. You get the edge detectors early, blah blah blah. And if you looked at the wiring of the brain, you could kind of say, well, how else is that? Like, what else is that going to detect? But of course, in terms of the brain, like it was developed a little bit differently. Like evolution's the one that figured out that wiring, and so the representations were kind of um, built by
Yeah.
evolution as it was also figuring out like how do we the learning process of the brain. So it's a little bit different, but like I don't know. How do you feel about like, well, maybe it's analogous to the wiring that evolution kind of forced on the brain, and then the learning mechanisms, the representations. Maybe it's not that surprising since they're both constrained in the same way, but and maybe that's kind of your point that we shouldn't be that blown away because that's kind of
Yeah.
how we have it wired up. But it still kind of is at a coarse enough level a similar process going on. How do you kind of feel about that?
Yeah. So I guess um, I see that there are analogies and those analogies work sometimes. Mostly in like handpicked examples, right? My point is more that I don't think it's surprising that computer vision models have some coarse level similarities to the mammalian visual system. I think I think two things. I think one, when you start scratching into when you start digging deeper into the data and looking at the details of the papers where people show evidence for this, it becomes a lot less convincing because you see how much they have to search to find, this eye neuron, right, in a computer vision model. That you can find one cell, one neuron, artificial neuron, that seems to respond selectively, or at least, largely selectively to eyes, right? They had to search through thousands of artificial neurons to find that one, right? So it's a little bit less compelling there.
Yeah.
But the point I was trying to make earlier is that um, I don't think it's trivial that the mammalian visual system is set up the way it is, but we modeled the computer vision systems after the human visual system,
Yeah.
or after the mammalian vision system. So therefore, you cannot make claims that are philosophical or like scientific, or I think it all interesting that there are some parallels that start to emerge because that's how we design them. It would be like, I don't know what's a great analogy. It's like, you have an airplane and it's like, oh my God, airplanes are just like birds, right? It's like, no, and then you say, well, there's something special about flying. Okay, I'm losing my analogy here, but let's say, okay, this is a really dumb analogy. Let's say you draw a picture of a bird, and then someone says, oh, there's something magical, there's something, universal that
Mm.
nature has figured out about the shape of birds because I see it on this piece of paper, which is not a physical bird. And you're like, no, 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 this is like, I literally drew this picture because I wanted it to look like that thing. So, of
Right.
course, they're going to look a little bit similar.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. And I think your other point that like you have to look really hard for the specific units. Like the other problem with that is there's a confirmation bias there going on, right? You're only looking for the patterns that you know to look for, right? And so there's kind of a um, you're not necessarily capturing all of the weird representations that we don't even know how to think about that don't occur in the brain. Um,
Yes. And so let me just interject on what
yeah.
little tidbit about this. When you read these paper, there's these beautiful images where they like artificially activate this neuron
Mm.
that they find like the eye neuron, and then they trace the activation patterns back to the input, so they can generate an image
Right.
where you see all these eyeballs all over the place, and it's like weird and mysterious and beautiful in a terrifying kind of horror movie sort of way. But if you read those papers carefully, you will see that they go through all of these filters and all of these methods to get the image to look like that. And they will say that, they tried doing other experimental approaches for getting images that were interpretable, and they didn't use them because they produced something that just looked like white noise or something that just looked like waves in the image instead of eyeballs. So even, these carefully picked examples, they're, yeah, I don't want to sound too negative because this work is really beautiful, but
Yeah.
they have to go through so many hoops and do so many data transformations and so much searching and indeed confirmation bias until they find the pattern that, that is consistent with the argument that they're trying to make.
Right. Yeah. And another kind of like interesting argument against these being like human eyes are these what's the term that these like adversarial images for that you can use where like to a human this looks the exact same. You have two images that look the exact same, and one it like says horse, and a human looks at it and like, yeah, of course it's a horse. The other one looks exactly same horse, but there's been some subtle manipulation of the pixels such that the image recognition algorithm says, oh yeah, that's a platypus or whatever. Like it just like very clearly something different is going on under the hood because to
Yeah.
a human, it's like, not, like very clear that there's no difference between the images, but something is different in the kind of underlying math going on in the LLM. That um, uh, awesome. So we're at the hour mark. So we can kind of like I need to get going pretty soon, but maybe we can wind down with a little bit of should we just discuss your like academia, leaving academia, and maybe we can leave on a positive note about optimism about neuroscience. So it sounds
Sure.
yeah. Let's talk. So you were a very successful neuroscience professor for a while. Like what kind of made you want to leave and start this kind of self-employed teaching thing that you're doing now?
Um, yeah, so there's many reasons. I don't have one specific reason. I did write a Substack post about, I think it's titled "Why I Left Academia and Neuroscience," something like that. So for people who are interested, they can read it a little bit more. I guess, yeah, there were professional reasons and personal reasons. Some of the professional reasons were related to um, my kind of growing disappointment after having been in neuroscience for 2 decades. And maybe I can tie back to this when we talk about optimism. Um, and second was personal reasons. And a lot of those personal reasons were related to just kind of a little bit just like being bored. I think if you do a job, and it wasn't just a job, like that was my career, that was a huge part of my identity was being an academic scientist and a neuroscientist. And when you do that for like 25 years, then I don't know, man, eventually like it just starts getting a little bit stale. Like every day felt like the same day. Every experiment felt like the same experiment. Every paper felt, so. And I, I had like, I don't know, I started having these, um, I don't want to call them fantasy, but like just frightful imaginations of being like 99 years old on my deathbed. I was like 5 breaths left before an infinity of non-existence. And looking back on my life and thinking, yeah, I did exactly the same research for 60, I basically I published 500 papers, but it's really only five
Yeah,
papers that I just republished each 100 times. And that's all I did with my, and I don't know, that thought felt kind of heavy and oppressive, and it made me feel like old and stale. And so that was basically my personally. I just wanted some more like, I wanted some uncertainty and adventure in my life. I wanted to not know where I would be or what I would be doing in a year from now. And as an academic, as a junior academic, like a PhD student and a postdoc, you have that uncertainty, and it's anxiety producing and so on. And I get that, but I don't know. I want that level of uncertainty in my life.
yeah, yeah. I feel like there's
That's part
like
of it.
maybe a right level of uncertainty. Especially like if you have some level of security. Like I don't know. I remember the postdoc days. Like yeah, a lot of excitement, but yeah, a lot of anxiety, and sometimes that anxiety was a little bit much. But um,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, I can imagine. Like I wasn't an academic nearly as long as you, and but I can imagine I mean, I've never stuck at a job more than I guess 4 years.
yeah,
So the idea of staying in place for decades is definitely something that I can imagine getting tough. Uh,
yeah. So that was part of it. Another part was that I started feeling increasingly. I don't know. I had these weird personal feelings. I don't know if guilt is the right word, but I have, um, I was sort of born into like privilege. Like I'm a white male, right? So, and I just started feeling like the research that I started feeling an increasing obligation to contribute something positive
mm,
to the world. And I do feel that, kind of weird academic esoteric knowledge is a contribution, but at a very like kind of vague, diffuse,
Right.
minor scale. I wanted to have a more immediate impact on people,
Yeah.
on people's lives.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, how could I do that? And I think teaching is one way that I found to do that. So, yeah, I wanted to be in an environment where I could have a much broader range of students to a much larger audience,
Mm.
a much more diverse audience from around the world.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that was also part of it. I just felt like um, at my university, I also didn't have a teaching position. I was only a research professor. So I had a research lab and so on. So yeah, it just wasn't possible for me to have the kind of reach that I wanted to have and feel like I was really contributing to the world in at a scale that I wanted. So that was another kind of personal motivation.
Yeah, yeah. So to your point about, publishing 500 papers, but only five of them being only actually five, and I mean, I had some of that too. Like, even though I only published a handful of papers, like a couple of them were basically the same paper, right? And I'm curious your thoughts on like, uh, well, like what we've talked a lot about how complicated the brain is, how complicated even like a system like an LLM is. So, like, what uh, makes you? What would you point to if I asked you, like, hey, what are you hopeful about in terms of the future of neuroscience? 'Cause for me personally, what part of the reason I got out of neuroscience, out of academia, was I felt like everything I'm doing is such like it's so constraining, like trying to do a single experiment, do a single behavioral paradigm, single method, right? It's like it's so hard to try to answer the big questions when you're every experiment is in a sense so small. But then when you're able to take a step back, for me at least, it was kind of helpful to take a step back. And some of the writing I'm doing now, it's a little bit. It's nice to be able to take a step back and see the forest for the trees a little bit more, and try to figure out how the different pieces connect. Um, but I'm curious if that's uh, when you take a step back at the broader field, like, do you feel any? Are we ever going to figure out this brain thing? Like, what makes you hopeful for like future breakthroughs and stuff in the future of neuroscience?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts about that. One is that um, in general, if you look at the history of science, it tends to plateau for a while and then it'll spike up and then it plateaus for a while and then it spikes up. So, you know, it's easy for us now in 2026 to look back at, centuries of progress in mathematics and engineering and physics and chemistry and so on. And it kind of, when if you read like the history book on like the history of science, right, it'll say, well, in 1623 there was this thing, and then in 1780
Right.
there was this next step. And it's like, okay, if you just read that at a superficial level, like, yeah, okay, things progressed over time.
Yeah.
But man, that's like 150 fucking years. We're like, what was going on? Like, okay, granted, there were very, very few scientists back then.
Yeah.
But imagine how frustrating it would be if you were trying to work in that field. You are not as smart as Gauss. I don't mean you, Tommy. I mean, like, imagine, like,
Yeah. I definitely am. No. Yeah.
like, okay, I'm like reasonably intelligent. I'm not smart enough to create a paradigm shift in neuroscience.
Yeah.
And so imagine how frustrating it is to be working in a field where you're smart enough to work in the field, you're smart enough to make some, sort of incremental edge improvements. You're smart enough to see that something is wrong, but you're not smart enough to understand what is wrong and how to fix it and how to think better and how to solve these problems. Like going back to the single neuron doctrine, right? So I'm quite convinced that the single neuron doctrine has been the single most important idea for the development of neuroscience. But I'm equally convinced that it's taken us basically as far as we can go in neuroscience, and it's not going to get us much further. But I don't know what is, I'm not even remotely smart enough to think about what is the next thing. Like, what's
Yeah.
the next big theory for how the brain actually represents and computes information? And um, so for me personally, um, I have found it very frustrating to see basically a lack of real meaningful progress in neuroscience. Every week there's new papers, there's new data, there's new experiments and so on. But that doesn't mean that we're really learning a lot of new things in different ways, right? And so that's been frustrating to me. So, your question was about um, whether and why I'm optimistic about the future of neuroscience. I think the long arc of human history bends towards progress and prosperity and health and knowledge. But that's like a very long arc over centuries. I'm very optimistic about neuroscience over the next decades to centuries, but I'm not very optimistic about the future of neuroscience in the next like 10 or 20 years because it's hard for me to imagine how it's going to be different from the last 10 to 20 years.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm just not creative enough or like
Yeah.
open-minded enough. But yeah, so I think that's my answer. I'm very optimistic about the long-term future of neuroscience. I think in 100 years from now, there's going to be, the history of neuroscience and basically like the 1990s was an explosion of neuroscience research, like fMRI,
Right.
thinking about the brain as networks and so on. These were all incredible advancements in neuroscience, but there hasn't really been a lot since then. And so I think in 100 years, people are going to say, man, it must have been pretty shitty to be a neuroscientist between 2010 and 2060, right? Because 2060 was like when, some genius had the next amazing, like completely reshaped
Yeah.
how we think about nervous systems. And yeah, so I hope whoever figures that out is working on it. But yeah, so I don't know. I think that for me personally, um, I think I've made a decision that my intellectual and creative energy and my time is better spent doing other things outside of neuroscience.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, thanks for that. The way you're describing that kind of reminds me of as part of my book club, we read The Idea of the Brain uh, by Cobb. And probably my favorite part of the book was that, like at the very end, after writing this history of neuroscience and going through like kind of the modern period of all of the different like broad level areas, like methodologies and things we've learned from them. At the very end, he's like, I don't know what the future holds for it, but maybe, you know, uh, all that fMRI data will come together. It's like someone will put the pieces together in some sort of way. Maybe the connectome will finally, and he just go like lists all of these possible, methods that maybe the next inspiration will just come from that. Like, and we just don't know, right? You just don't know what the next spark that's going to ignite the next paradigm that pushes neuroscience to the next level is. So just you were kind of like reminding me of that the way you were talking about this. So very cool. All right. So I think I should get going. My kids are at home since it's a snow day, so I got to go get back to them. But any last thoughts before we sign off here?
No, I guess I did want to see if there were questions posted in the chat that we could discuss, but I apologize to people who posted
Oh,
interesting
there
questions.
was a question a while. Do LLMs have nerve cells?
Oh yeah, yeah. In my opinion, the answer is no, but it's a very interesting discussion about why the answer is no. And yeah, I have that recent Substack post about it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't think we got. I know Mike was. You had some call outs to um, giving links to your materials in the chat, which I thought was very nice. So thanks, um, Fanny, and I think somebody else. Oh, it was Fanny, but twice. So yeah, thank you, Fanny, for doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this was great. Thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your expertise.
Yeah, and thanks to you. Yeah, this was great. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. All
Um,
right. Great.
I assume most people are here because of you, but if anyone is here because of me and they don't know Tommy, then you should definitely check out Tommy's Substack. It's really interesting, really thought-provoking. I really enjoy reading your posts.
Well, thank you. And likewise, subscribe to Mike if you are not already. And I'll be putting up a recording of this in case anybody here missed the first parts. I'll put that up probably tomorrow at some point. Yeah, thank you so much.
Cool. Thanks.
All right.
See you later.